Thank you for signing on to the webinar. We will be starting at 1:30. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Flooding 411, our second seminar in our summer seminar series. Today, we're going to be talking about who's who for flood management and recovery. Our speakers today that you will hear from will be Ellen Stirrup-Comeau with Clemson University Cooperative Extension and Maria Cox-Lamb with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. I will be your moderator today. My name is Brooke Sari from South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, and my partner, Emmy Pallenbaum, will be assisting us as well. And we are filling in for the Ace Basin National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is one of our partners. And so each of our partner organizations like to sponsor one of the webinars throughout the summer, and so I'm filling in. So pretend that I am Abby from the near, and thank you for joining us. So what we will do today is we are in a webinar format, as you can see, and so all your cameras and microphones are muted automatically. If you are noticing a bandwidth issue, close other programs to try and preserve that bandwidth, which you should do anyway. And if you have technical issues, you can always leave and join again, which should help fix those. And today we're going to be utilizing the Q&A box for questions. And so you should see a bar that looks like this, where you have a raise hand function and a Q&A. We will not be using the raise hand function, but any questions you can enter into that Q&A box and we will respond to them. And for each of our speakers, you can put questions in there at any point during their talks, and then we will address those in the Q&A. And any that we don't get to, if we happen to run out of time, we will make sure to get answers from those speakers to you in our post follow-up email. And as you heard, this is a webinar series, and so this is our second of 4, and so it will be every week. We have 2 left after this, and so I hope you will join us for reducing flood impacts to your property and community and successful community flood management on the 22nd and 29th of June. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our speakers. And our first one that's going to kick it off is going to be Ellen from Clemson University Extension with Who's Who for Flood Management and Recovery. So Ellen, I'm going to stop sharing and you take it away.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Brooke. Let me just share my screen with y'all. All right, just making sure I have everything up and running. All right, well, thank you all once again for joining us. As Brooke said, my name's Ellen. I'm a Water Resources Extension Agent down in Beaufort County. And today in my talk, I'm going to be going over kind of like who's who in the flood management and recovery world. But predominantly, I'm going to be covering the roles and responsibilities of government agencies in flood preparedness and recovery. So the goal of my presentation is kind of give you a quick overview to the many different agencies involved in flood management and recovery. Before we begin, though, we should keep in mind that flooding is a complex issue. The governmental agencies tasked to help with these issues are also complex. The reality of how these agencies interact can be depicted like a woven net. Each agency is a single strand in the net, which means no agency stands alone or is solely responsible for managing floods and the subsequent recovery efforts. All of the involved agencies communicate and rely upon each other for the resources, research, and funding to make our communities resilient. Their cooperation creates a net to keep people, or in this case, oranges, safe. However, trying to explain how the different agencies interact would make this presentation much longer than it needs to be. So I'm going to focus on what each agency offers residents. I'm going to start at the basis of flood management and recovering efforts, your local governments. Then I'll discuss the roles that different state agencies play and conclude by explaining how federal agencies assist with flood management and recovery. However, because I will be discussing which agency to contact and when regarding flooding, there are a few things to keep in mind. The first is that flooding is complicated with almost no immediate solutions. Sometimes solutions will take time to implement, cost money to install, or require adaptation instead of mitigation. The second is that recurrent flooding issues tend to be prioritized over non-recurrent flooding issues. That isn't to say that non-recurrent flooding isn't a problem or is never addressed. The priority of any flooding issue is highly dependent upon your local situation and your circumstances. But this is something that you could encounter, so you should keep it in mind. And finally, flooding affects many people, particularly if we're talking about a singular event. But there are only so many staff members available to assist everyone. So that means officials may not be able to respond to you immediately. They will respond to you, though. So patience and a kindly worded follow-up email or phone call can be key. All right, now with those things in mind, it's so important to start with your local government because they're truly the front lines of flood management and recovery. They have local knowledge regarding flooding patterns, ordinances, and resources available to you. Flood risk and issues tend to be highly localized, so this makes your local officials the best place to start asking for help. There are also ones that can advocate for your community and to receive greater levels of assistance from state and federal agencies if necessary. Typically, the first step to addressing a flood issue is to contact your local public works department. These departments are typically responsible for infrastructure maintenance, repairs, and other related services. There may be a more specialized office within your local government, such as a stormwater department, floodplain management division, or watershed management office that could better serve you. And if you do call your public works and there's another one of those offices, they'll be more than happy to direct you to the appropriate person to talk to. I do want to say that if you experience nuisance flooding, which is like water in your yard or water in the street, but absolutely not water in your house, That's when you really need to report the issue to your local public works department. They'll be able to come and assess the problem. And sometimes nuisance flooding like that can be remedied by clearing out a blocked storm drain or a ditch. But other times the situation is more complicated and cannot be resolved immediately. In these situations, your local public works department can help you find resources while looking for a solution. Now, if you're experiencing structural flooding, that is water in your house, please let the public works department know about it after you are safe. They may not be able to assist immediately, but they should be made aware so they can check the infrastructure in the area. And please note that in general, the public works departments will not perform any repair work on private property. If you need additional help, you can ask them for recommendations on who to call. All right, the next person to contact regarding structural flooding and nuisance flooding too, in addition to your public works department, is the local floodplain manager. You can also ask your local floodplain manager for information on the next steps for flood recovery and local flooding ordinances. And you may need to search your local government's website or call a representative to determine if the floodplain manager is part of your local public works department, the planning department, stormwater department, or a different department altogether. Floodplain managers operate a community program of preventative and corrective measures to reduce the risk of current and future flooding. All communities with a national flood insurance program have floodplain managers, as they are the ones responsible for handling both FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program's requirements and recommendations to keep your community enrolled and eligible for different funding sources. Floodplain managers also manage the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system, also known as CRS, the Flood Insurance RATMate, or FIRM, information, and as well as developments within the special flood hazard areas. All right, so now that we've discussed local agencies, it's time to discuss the different roles state agencies play in flood management and recovery. The South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, or DHEC, is charged with promoting and protecting the health of the public and those in, and the environment in South Carolina. They are also the main regulatory and permitting agency for environmental and health projects, such as the flood mitigation and recovery. The agency runs several programs related to flooding, such as the Dam and Reservoir Safety Program, the Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management, the Drinking Water Program, the Septic System Program, and the Private Well Program. Residents can contact DHEC or check and apply for permits. They can get help with program-specific interests, like testing your drinking water after a flood, or to report environmental issues. You can find your local DHEC Environmental Affairs office at their contact information at this link. And don't worry, we're not going to put it in the chat, but all of these links are going to be clickable in the PDF that I send out with a copy of this presentation. So while DHEC is the main regulatory body in the state, there are also several other state agencies that are set up to help with the technical expertise and funding for flood-related planning and projects. One such agency is the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, or DNR. DNR's mission is to serve as a principal advocate for and steward of South Carolina's natural resources. And one way they do so is to manage the flood mitigation program, which helps communities manage their risk by administering the National Flood Insurance Program statewide, assisting floodplain managers, providing technical expertise, and overseeing the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. And by the way, our next speaker is going to be from this program. So I definitely look forward to her talk. But that being said, while residents can contact DNR's flood mitigation program for assistance or for a greater understanding of flooding and the NFIP at the state level, they would be much better served by contacting their local representatives instead. And I have included a link to the contact page. All right, so the next agency I'm going to talk about is the South Carolina Emergency Management Division, or SCEMD. SCEMD's mission is to develop, coordinate, and lead the state emergency management program, enabling effective preparation for, response to, and recovery from emergencies and disasters in order to save lives, reduce human suffering, and minimize property loss. In short, this is the agency that's responsible for all the logistics in terms of making sure that each county emergency management department has up-to-date plans, resources, and support for emergencies. They also support first responders and provide public with information to help them prepare for an emergency, as well as find shelters and updates during a disaster. They can also help people find resources for recovery. And to access this agency's resources, please visit their webpage. The final state agency that deals with flood management and recovery is the South Carolina Office of Resilience, or SCORE. And this is a new state agency, and it did absorb the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office and its mission. So currently, SCORE is responsible for coordinating all mitigation and recovery resources from all agencies, including local, state, and federal agencies. Currently, they are creating the statewide risk reduction and resiliency plan, which will inform their future projects. However, they're also aiming to provide financial assistance in the form of grants, loans, and matching funds for recovery, mitigation, planning, buyouts, education projects, and even more. This organization would not be able to offer much direct assistance to residents, though. But if you have questions about them and what they do, you can contact their public information director, Carissa Cochran, at this email address. All right, now we're transitioning to the role of federal agencies in flood mitigation and recovery. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, does not do any flood mitigation and recovery work directly, but they do offer assistance to rural land users for multiple different projects. If you fall under their purview, you can actually contact them to see if there's any assistance available. And I've included a link to the webpage that describes the different kinds of assistance they might offer. All right, but unlike NCRS, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, does not provide any direct assistance to residents, but they are an incredibly important agency when it comes to flooding mitigation and recovery. NOAA's mission is to understand and predict changes in climate, weather, oceans, and coasts, to share that knowledge and information with others, and to conserve and manage the coastal marine ecosystems and resources. They're the ones who will tell you that a flood is coming and to help you understand your risk. They're also the ones that help with resiliency planning and predominantly research. Now, NOAA does this for South Carolina through two main programs, the National Weather Service and the Office for Coastal Management. The National Weather Service is the primary source of weather, hydrologic, and climate data and provides the forecasts and warnings for the United States. So these are the people who send the alerts to your phones when something's going on. Now, the Office for Coastal Management, on the other hand, is the federal agency tasked with the implementation of the Coastal Zone Management Act, which is the guiding legislation that covers the decisions and actions taken to keep the natural environment, the built environment, quality of life, and economic prosperity of our coastal areas in balance. I've included to both those offices' website so you can explore the myriad of tools and knowledge base. They have so many fact sheets, so many cool tools. I honestly cannot recommend checking out their page enough. All right. However, like NOAA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is actually an agency that I hear residents talk about a lot. However, this agency really only gets involved in very specific circumstances. Most of their work and resources are tied to specific projects, and these projects have specific eligibility requirements and require certain authorities, like your local government, to be involved. These projects tend to be large scale and something that local governments apply for when they're in need of assistance. Projects can be structural, like seawalls, or non-structural, such as land conservation and research studies. The Floodplain Management Services Program and the Flood Risk Management Program are prime examples of the type of work that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers can do, but there are also many other programs and resources available for communities as a whole. The Army Corps of Engineers is also the permitting authority for doing work in and around waters of the states and wetlands. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has an office in Charleston, and I've actually included a link to the website for more information, but residents should rarely have a need to contact the Army Corps of Engineers themselves, but they can do so in the rare case that you need a specific permit or to get hard copies of particular documents. All right, the meat and potatoes. The National Flood Insurance Program is also a federal program that comes up frequently. As an overview, this program functions just like any other insurance. However, homeowners can acquire flood insurance and receive compensation for damages due to a flood after successfully filing a claim. Now, where it differs is that the insurance is managed by FEMA, and if it's determined that you live in a high-risk flood area, you may be required to carry flood insurance in order to receive disaster relief funding from FEMA, low-interest disaster loans by the U.S. Small Business Administration, and mortgages. However, everyone can carry flood insurance should they wish. To access this insurance or to file a claim, you'll need to contact your local insurance agent or carrier. All right, and I'm going to end today's presentation by talking about FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Now, FEMA is a very large organization that does many things, so I'm only covering a fraction of what they do. Their overall mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters, and they do so in multiple ways. They are a major funding source for pre-disaster resiliency and post-disaster recovery, as well as they manage the National Flood Insurance Program and the related programs and risk assessment tools. They do all of this, though, by partnering with local and state agencies, because as we mentioned before, flooding is a really complicated issue, and it's also a really local issue. So getting to know your local government and state agencies is key to understanding flood issues. All right, to apply for assistance with recovering from a flood, you can follow the first link, but to access the flood-related tools and information, you can follow the second link. And this is actually where I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you so much for watching. I know I didn't cover every single agency that has to do with flood management or recovery, but I did hit the most useful and the most well-known to residents. I look forward to talking with you guys in the future, but are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Ellen. I do not see any questions that have come in yet. So let's go ahead and transition to Maria's presentation. And if something comes in while we do the transition, I will let you know.
All right, sounds good.
Awesome, thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Maria Cox-Lamb, and she is the Certified Floodplain Manager and State Coordinator for South Carolina Department of Natural Resources Flood Mitigation Program. And we are going to learn about the National Flood Insurance Program basics. So Maria, please take it away. And I just want to say, if you have questions, please remember, put them in the Q&A box, and we will have a session at the end of Maria's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke and Ellen. We're going to tie all this together, hopefully a little bit. So I'm going to cover the National Flood Insurance Program and hopefully some specifics for South Carolina. So we'll get started. And first, a little background on our National Flood Insurance Program stats in South Carolina. There are 239 participating communities. There's 46 of those 239 that are in the community rating system. 19% of the state lies within a special flood hazard area. We have 17,651 mapped riverine and coastal miles in the special flood hazard area, and we're sixth in the nation for flood insurance policies. We come in second in Region 4, which is our FEMA region, only to Florida. So we're doing pretty good at keeping people insured in this state, and hopefully we can keep that up. Okay, so local responsibilities. Being an NFIP community, participation in the NFIP is voluntary. And to be a participating member, you must, as a community, agree to adopt and enforce. That's the most important part. You adopt it and enforce what's called a flood damage prevention ordinance. So that ordinance becomes law in the community. So it must meet the minimum NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program regulations that are outlined in the Code of Federal Regulations, or as we call it, the CFR, because all good programs, everything must have an acronym. So I'll try really hard not to use those guys. But the Code of Federal Regulations, as far as floodplain management goes, they guide state, federal, and local floodplain management activities, and there are policies and procedures for floodplain management contained in those. They are located in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 59 through 78, and then Part 9 as well. So that's where the minimum requirements are. Now, a local government is allowed to adopt and enforce higher regulatory standards. So they can have the most common higher regulatory standard is freeboard. So that's that magic line of the base flood elevation plus so many feet. On average, we have most communities either have a 2-foot or a 3-foot freeboard. In South Carolina, we do have a couple of communities that have a 4-foot freeboard. Now, SCDNR's role, as you heard in the previous presentation, we have a specific role. So since these federal regulations that govern floodplain management are adopted and enforced at the local level, DNR does not have regulatory power regarding floodplain management. The flood mitigation program, we provide technical assistance, training, ordinance interpretation. We ensure compliance of the 239 communities. So we actually audit them on a rotating basis to see if they're meeting their requirements to stay in the National Flood Insurance Program. Because the way this works is FEMA, the federal government says, hey, you adopt and enforce that ordinance, and in return, we're going to offer you the ability to purchase federal flood insurance. So that's the tie-in. And so we've got to make sure that they're compliant, that they're staying in line with what their ordinance says and enforcing correctly. But our role is not to step in and take over a community's program if they're having problems with enforcement. That's not what we do. And like I said, we evaluate the program. And then what we do is we send our recommendation to FEMA for any enforcement action against the community, because FEMA is the one that ultimately can do these enforcement options that are on there, which is probation or suspension. One other option that's available to FEMA is actually to, if a community is participating in the community rating system, they can remove them from that program, thus taking the reduction in flood insurance premium away from the policyholders. Probation adds $50 to each policy, and suspension, of course, removes the ability to purchase flood insurance at all in a community. So a lot of times people ask, is something like this supposed to happen? So a home is elevated, but yet water is underneath it. And the answer is yes. This is floodplain management. This is what's supposed to happen. The home or the building has been elevated to that base flood elevation. If there's freeboards, those additional feet. And what the end result is, the water will go under the home, but it won't end up in the home as long as that flood doesn't exceed whatever level the home's been built to. Now, we've seen this. This is actually a photograph I took from a helicopter during one of our mini flood events. You will see a couple of the homes have put up, if you want to call it like a water barrier, some people might consider that a type of levee around to protect their home. That's great for that homeowner, but they just increase their liability during a flood because they're not allowing the water to come into their structure. They're pushing more water onto the surrounding structures, and they're actually liable for that in this state, because in South Carolina, the lowest person must take the water. So that's something to keep in mind, that you can increase your liability during a flood by deploying these measures. So what do you need to know? And Ellen alluded to this. All floodplain management is handled at the local level. Here's a link we keep a list of all of the 239 communities contacts as to whom the floodplain manager is for that community. So every NFIP participating community also has a flood ordinance, that flood damage prevention ordinance, as I called it earlier. The ordinance does not apply outside of the special flood hazard area unless they've adopted it that way and specifically said that it will apply over an entire community. The only place we really typically see that is at the coast. Sometimes they will adopt it to apply over the entire community. The flood mitigation program does not have enforcement authority over local governments, so we will help you mitigate an issue, but we cannot go in and take over their program, as I said before. And floodplain management regulations, that regulates how you build in that special flood hazard area. Now, mapping. Who does mapping in South Carolina? That's actually our program. The flood mitigation program is the cooperating technical partner with FEMA to create the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, or as they're affectionately called, FIRMs. You might hear that term in South Carolina. FEMA reviews and officially issues all FIRMs, but we actually produce all of that information, then FEMA reviews, and then all of the official letters actually come from FEMA. It's a joint venture, if you want to consider it that way, between us and the federal government. SCDR, FEMA, and the local communities work together in the development of those FIRMs. We hold lots of meetings, we provide lots of information. So there's a lot of floodplain terminology out there that can be quite confusing. One is the term base flood versus base flood elevation. So base flood is actually a flood having equaled or exceeded, or having a 1% chance of being equal or exceeded in any given year. So that's also deemed a 100-year flood. So don't let that confuse you. It's not that once every 100 years we're going to flood. It's actually a 1% chance in any given year. we can equal or exceed that type of flood. Now, then there's that base flood elevation. You heard me use that term just a minute ago. That's the estimated level of floodwater that is anticipated. So that level that it's going to get to during that base flood. You have the term floodplain or flood zone. So that's any land susceptible to being inundated by floodwaters of any source. We also use the term regulatory floodway. So that's the portion of the channel or the river that is actually the most dangerous. So it is reserved to discharge the base flood without increasing the water surface elevation everywhere. But basically, that's where the velocities are the highest. That's where the water is the most dangerous. It's moving the most swiftly. And we want to keep development regulated more stringently in those areas. You've heard the term special flood hazard area. That's the part of the floodplain subject to being inundated by the base flood for us in this part of the country. Other parts of the country, they have erosion hazards. Notice something. Many people use these terms interchangeably, special flood hazard area and floodplain. They actually mean two different things. The special flood hazard area is actually the regulatory floodplain designated by the flood insurance rate map and where that ordinance applies, that a local government attests to. A floodplain can actually be a larger area because more area might flood than what's designated as being regulated by the federal government. So keep that in mind. So what is a special flood hazard area? It identifies that 1% annual chance of flooding every year. It is used for how a flood ordinance is applied and for mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. So if you're in the special flood hazard area and you have a federally backed loan, you're going to be required to purchase flood insurance. Now, I mentioned flood zones. It's important to keep in mind anywhere it rains, it can flood. So everyone actually technically lives in a flood zone. There's high hazard and lower hazard flood zones. We'll get to that in a minute. But here's the type of flood zones we basically have in South Carolina. We have A and AE zones. Those are typically along rivers and the backside of coastal. We also have VE zones. Those are oceanfront typically, but they're found at the coast. And then you have X zones, which are outside of that 1% or even the 0.2%, which most people think of as the 500-year. But those areas, as far as true X, we also have shaded X that falls under X zones. So that's more of that 0.2%. Now, in rivers, it's really important. Rivers are handled differently than the coast. A little different type of engineering and technology used to determine the special flood hazard area. But the special flood hazard area makes up two sections. So you have the floodway, like I said, it includes the channel and where the highest velocities will be. And then you have the flood fringe, which is the outer layers, which is where like fill is allowed and you're allowed to build more information. So that's more, and then the base flood elevation is set using a model, an engineering model that allows that base flood elevation to actually be set. And so this is what we would deem like a detailed flood state. This would be an AE flood zone, the way this is depicted. So for example, here's what it looks like on that infamous flood insurance rate map. So it is, you're going to have different shading. The shading is indicative of the different types of the flood zone, and you would be able to indicate where the floodway is versus that fringe, and then that shaded X for the 500-year or the 0.2%, as well as a traditional X zone, which is depicted typically in white. And that's how it looks when you're dealing with a river. Now, if you move to the coast, you have, as we showed, the VE zone, and then behind the VE zone, they reuse the AE zone, and you can now have what's called a limit of moderate wave action, which is indicated on here as LIMWA, is how that's pronounced. Basically, what they've done is FEMA has realized that there can be damages between a VE and this. VEs are wave heights of 3 feet or greater. So when it reached 3 feet, they were like, oh, we'll put you in an AE and we'll let you build to AE standards. So you're not having to build on piles and columns, things along those lines, you go down to regular crawl space, but they were seeing a lot of damages. So they've indicated a line between 3 feet and 1.5 feet, and that's what most people deem as a coastal AE zone. So communities have that area identified, and they can adopt increased regulations if they so choose. And then outside of that, you do go to the traditional AE zone, and that's anything less than 1.5 feet. South Carolina does have that limit of moderate wave action identified on their map. I'll show you on the next slide. Now, at the coast, you will see we start from the VE, the Atlantic Ocean, it's VE, and then it'll drop to AE, and you see this lovely little line that has these little arrows or flags on it. That's indicating where the Limois line ends, the way the arrows are pointing. That area is the coastal AE zone. So that area, community might decide they want to adopt B zone standards in that area. So they can generate on the front side of the island, and then on the back side of the island, it can regenerate because the waves can get to higher than 1.5 feet on the back side of an island. So that is why you see it indicated on both sides. Now, river flooding is something to keep in mind. River flooding is just as dangerous as storm surge that comes in. They are equally as dangerous. You can see here, this is a South Carolina property that the storm surge came in and did quite a bit of damage to the structure. Now, it's more wave damage is what's happening in wind damage, but in the picture adjacent to it, that is very high river flooding. Some of those structures might be hard to see, but some of those structures are actually containing 5 to 10 feet of water inside of them. And so while the velocities are lower, the damage is catastrophic in a different way, but just as catastrophic to the individual. Now, the way regulations and mapping work, for every type of mapped flood zone, there is a corresponding regulation that goes along with it that indicates how you can build, what you can build, how you can impact these areas, because the NFIP doesn't just regulate structures being built, it regulates all development within the special flood hazard areas. That includes fill, mining, retaining walls, stream restoration, wanting to move a stream, anything along those lines, along with building a structure. All of that is regulated by that flood damage prevention ordinance. So they also build as stair steps. That's why it's indicated here like a set of stairs. So that 44 CFR 60.3A, when you get all the way to D, where you have base flood elevations and a floodway, everything from A, B, and C applies in D as well. So it's built to step like that. And then, of course, if you're coastal, everything before up to that level E, that's where the regulations are in section E, you would, all those would be included as well. What you kind of need to know when it comes to mapping. SCDNR receives no state funding for mapping. The state relies solely on funding from FEMA. So if you feel like your map's taking forever to come, we're right there with you. We have to depict solely on how FEMA funds us. And so that is something that's important to know. We marched through the state. We've actually made it all the way through the state. Georgetown County is the last countywide study to go effective, and we are working on that actively at the moment. It's in its third appeal period. And then after that, every county has gone, and we have already started the watersheds, which is what we've gone to. FEMA has had us move to. So we are marching back through the state again. During this process, local governments actually identify the needs for updated mapping. So make sure you're letting that local floodplain manager know if you're having issues, because they are the ones that actually identify the mapping needs, and we use that information to determine where we map. Force maps are used for multiple purposes, and every flood zone has corresponding regulations. That's one thing to remember. And where it can rain, it can flood. So I alluded to this earlier, we like to talk about your true level of flood risk. So your true level of flood risk is more along the lines of, we don't like to talk about being in the special flood hazard area or out of it, because that gives a indication that that line is magic and Mother Nature is going to be like, oh, there's the line. We can't go past that line. And that's not true in reality. We've seen it many times in the state, especially since 2015, that flooding can and does exceed where that special flood hazard area is. So just like I said earlier, the special flood hazard area is the regulatory portion of the floodplain, not the entire floodplain, not the entire area that could flood. Remember, everywhere it can rain, it can flood. So we like to use the terms of low, moderate, and high risk. So for example, a low risk would be an unshaded X zone. So that would be where it's white on the map and it's outside of that 0.2% or 500 year that you might be used to hearing it called. That's your low risk. Notice I don't say no risk. There's no 0% risk of flooding. Everywhere can flood. Then as you move closer to the special flood hazard area and you get into those shaded areas or you're just adjacent to it, you are what we would term a moderate risk at that point. So you've got a pretty good chance of flooding. And then as you move into the special flood hazard area, so you move into those zones where regulatory action is required and where flood insurance is required, those A, AE, AH, AO, or VE zones, those are the ones that require you to have flood insurance. And those are your highest risk. You're closest to that actual flooding source, whatever it might be, the Atlantic Ocean, the PD River, the Edisto River, whatever it might be. So how do we now help you understand what the flood risk is for a particular piece of property? Well, the most important way is, of course, talking to the local floodplain manager, but here's some resources they have that can be used in addition to just having a conversation with them and them knowing what's flooded and what hasn't in the past in your community. These are called depth grids, and we do them for multi-frequencies. In other words, multi-flood frequencies. So pay attention to point A, point B, and point C as we move through this. So we go to a 10-year flood. You will notice that point A now has got 1.8 feet. So not just, it says that the base flood elevation and the special flood hazard area say a certain level and a certain area will be equal or exceeded in a 1% chance in any given year. Doesn't mean it won't be flooding in that property at a lower event. So this is what this is depicting. You've got 2 points that are showing that they don't have any flooding around them, but yet you got 1.8 feet by point A. When we move to a 50-year or a 2% flood event, you're now at 4.4 feet at point A, and point B has moved to 1.4 feet. We see he's hanging in there on the outside, just outside of the special flood hazard area. That red line is special flood hazard area, by the way. Sorry, I should have told you that. Now, when we move to that 1% or that 100-year floodplain, you have 5.4 feet at the one point, you've got 2.3 at the other, and you're still hanging on outside of that special flood hazard area. However, when we move to the 500-year or that 0.2% chance, you now have 9.7 feet inside of one structure, or around one structure. We don't know if it's getting in it or not, or 6.6 feet around the structure where that point is indicating, and 1.7 feet just outside of the special flood hazard area. So it now has reached beyond the magic line drawn on the map. So this is exactly why we want to make sure everybody understands that that line doesn't mean you'll never flood if you're outside of that line. It means your risk is lower. You have a lower risk, but you still have a risk, especially when you're sitting adjacent to that special flood hazard area, because you may still lie within a floodplain. Now, another use of depth grids, I wanted to show you a specific use. This is actually a depth grid that actually 2015 flood, this is an area that flooded during 2015, and this is actually the depth grid that would correlate to the flood frequency that event was in this area. So you will see we're going to go into this particular structure right behind it, and you'll be able to see the depth grid. If you actually clicked right there, that depth grid would pull up that the depth of the water is 5.1 feet. So when you look in, this is actually that exact point in the field at the structure. This is where the high water mark was. And from inside the structure, you'll be able to see that's the high water mark, and it was approximately about 5 feet deep when the water went through that area. It's a very fast-moving water in this area. So here's a velocity grid. This is another grid we create, and indicating this is the same area. You can see the same two houses have points on them. And if you click, now this is inside the river, but makes it important. This is why you evacuate before the water gets there. You want to move out of the way of the water. If you click on this point in the depth grid, it's going to pull up that it is 11.6 feet per second is how fast that water is moving. If you convert that to miles per hour, that's 7.5 miles per hour. That water is booking it for water, and you can't stand up in 7.5 miles per hour water. It's going to knock you down, and you better be an Olympic swimmer or greater to be able to swim through that. So we want to make sure, this is why Swiftwater Rescue is the one, or somebody like a DNR law enforcement officer is going to come get you in a boat with a motor. And that's exactly what happened in this area. DNR came and got them with the game wardens came and got them with the boat. So it's important to remember this is very dangerous, and flooding can be quite dangerous and quite just as dangerous. These are rivers, just as dangerous on a river as it is on the ocean front. Now, another thing we do is most people think, oh, that 1% chance in any given year, that means, it's not a very high percentage chance that we could actually flood. So we put out what's called a percent chance of flooding over 30 years. So these are the same points we were looking at previously. You will notice point A has a 96% chance or greater, notice the plus, of flooding over 30 years. Why 30 years? That's the average mortgage that most individuals would use to finance a home. You notice point B has 78%, point C 7% over a 30-year mortgage. Also, we can pull up a percent chance of flooding annually. So that point A actually has a 10% chance annually, point B having 5%, and C having 0.4%. So depending on your location within the special flood hazard area, your actual annual chance of flooding can vary, being greater the closer you are to the flooding source. Now, at the coast, our coastal inundation we can provide a document or it's actually a GIS shapefile that shows the coastal increased inundation area. So it basically takes the base flood elevation plus 1 foot, plus 2 feet, or plus 3 feet, and you can depict that. That's what's showing here, and you can represent the additional areas that we've flooded by additional, if you want to call it hypothetical increases. So this can help with people understanding, like, if the map doesn't get updated as often as you would like, but what would it be if the base flood elevation increased 1 foot, 2 foot, or 3 foot? This is also for a local government a very good way to indicate a need for freeboard with higher risk. So what do you need to know out of this section? True flood risk is not determined only by the flood insurance rate map. That is one resource of many. There are many other tools. I know Ellen spoke of some of the great tools that NOAA has. There's also many local governments keep track of flooding and have the ability to tell you what areas have flooded, what areas, how deep they were. things along those lines. USGS as well has flood frequency information. There's a lot of tools out there. But, and of course, those flood risk products that we create as part of our map update, they also give you information as another source to help you understand what your true flood risk actually is. And it is greater than whether or not you're in or out of the special flood hazard area. That is not a good indication of your flood risk. That's an indication as to whether or not you need to purchase flood insurance, that mandatory purchase, and how you should be built trying to protect you from that flood, that impending flood. So now we're going to tie all this together. So flooding is complex and dynamic, especially considering, we'll get into this, but in South Carolina, most of the water does not originate in the state. We have water coming from other states that has to flow through our state to get to the Atlantic Ocean. So it makes it very complex and very dynamic when it comes to flooding. Many factors impact if a flood occurs, how much rain we get, what condition the rivers are in. A lot of those factors go into it, and true flood risk is not determined by one product alone, nor is it determined by one factor alone. One thing that's really, really important, because this has been something that has been a source of confusion for a lot of individuals, rainfall versus, so you hear about rainfall frequency, and then you hear about flood frequency. They are not a one-to-one correlation. They are actually two different frequencies. So you can have a rainfall, so you can have a 500-year or that 0.2% rainfall actually occur, and it will not necessarily produce a 500-year or 0.2% flood. They don't directly correlate. So you can hear a lot of times on the news, this gets confused. They're like, oh, we had a 1,000-year rainfall, so we got a 1,000-year flood. No, not how it works. You can have a 25-year rainfall produce greater than a 25-year flood event, and it can go the other way. You can have that 1,000-year rainfall only produce a 25-year flood, because there's more to it than just the amount of rain. Because when it comes to flooding, the basin size, the extent of everywhere it's raining, how long it rains, how hard it rains, the land use. So if it's heavily developed, or is it more agricultural, or is it some sort of park or forest, everything's going to create a difference. How fast the water runs off, how much absorbs into the ground, how big is the basin? Did it rain in the upper portion of the basin versus the lower portion of the basin? Did it rain over the entire basin? A lot of that, most of people understand how long it rains and how hard it rains. Today, many parts of the state got thunderstorms. It rains really hard for a short amount of time. That can produce not necessarily a lot of rain, but it rained really hard, very short amount of time, and can result in a flood event. So keep that in mind. Just a little information to help kind of depict some of this. In the state of South Carolina, the average annual precipitation since 1895 to 2020, here's what it is. And you will notice not really a trend of being too high or too low all the time, but green being kind of above normal, brown being below normal. You will notice something prior to 2015. We were at below normal rainfall for many years. So not necessarily in a drought, just below normal rainfall. So what does that do? That means, I'll be honest with you, for quite a number of years prior to 2015, we didn't flood, nor did we have a flood disaster declaration for 7 years prior. So what it's done is you're having an extended period of time where it's not acting normal. It's below normal rainfall, so therefore your flooding of impacts can be below normal as well, because you're just not receiving rain that could even potentially cause a flood. We still had areas that flooded, but it was not catastrophic. And then 2015 hit, and we've been more above normal or closer to normal than we were before. So now you're seeing more flood events, more consistent flood events. So keep that in mind. Now, flood frequency. This is specific. This is done by USGS, and I bring it up because this is the 2015 flood event. So we had pretty much a 1,000-year rainfall, but you can see, based on the arrows, these are where the gauges are, we didn't have a 1,000-year flood anywhere, but most people call it the 1,000-year flood. We had, specifically in the Lexington area, it was between a 10% or 10-year and 4% of 25-year flood. In the area, northern Florence County, you had between a 25-year and a 50-year, or a 4 and a 2%. In Orangeburg County, between a 2% and a 1%, so between a 50 and 100-year flood. And then in Williamsburg, now this is the area that took the most water. This is something that's interesting. The Black River watershed that runs through this area, the watershed took a uniformed, it's the only watershed that originates and exits inside of the state of South Carolina. That water flows through the state, or flows through that area, took the entire watershed took almost uniform rainfall, which is actually very rare, causing it to have the greatest flood event in that area. And USGS doesn't do anything other than, they said it's approximately a 500-year. It could be a little greater, but they stopped kind of in that 500-year area, so or a 0.2% flood. So it can vary, and all of that's based on conditions, like I said, how much water, how much rain, how it rained in the particular basin, all of that, and this is a good depiction of that. Now, we get a lot of questions about this, so I wanted to spend just a little bit on this, and it has to do with reservoirs and lakes and floodplains. They can impact and change movement and impact of flood flows, as we call them. So the flood, whatever the amount of water coming down the river. Reservoirs have a natural storage and often have the ability to kind of mute those peak flows, like keep them a little lower because they can hold back the water. But the level of impact does depend on, as with everything, as we've been saying, flooding complex, number of factors such as size, volume, upstream drainage area, and of course, how they operate that dam. Most reservoirs in the Carolinas, so North Carolina and South Carolina, are not designed for flood control purposes. However, the individuals that, or companies that operate those, operate the dams and operate the reservoirs can and often do change flow releases to try to accommodate storm flows. So there are times where they can hold water back and keep the water level a little lower coming down. And then there are times if the dam is in danger of failing, overtopping, or breaching, they have to release the water. So because a full-on breach of a dam is far more dangerous than a controlled release, even at a high level. So keeping that in mind, that the water flowing from upstream, while there might be a reservoir just over the state line in North Carolina, it is not designed for flood control. Most of those are hydroelectric, and there's only so much water they can hold back before they're going to have to release water downstream. Does it impact us? Yes. Is it nice if we know a storm's coming and they start letting water out and they can hold some of it back? That's a nice thing if we can forecast enough ahead of time to be able to do that. It does help in those cases. So not always a dam releasing water that's causing a problem downstream. It sometimes can be, but it's not completely. Now, another thing that's important is understanding how to actually read a gauge and how that gauge information correlates to that base flood elevation, or the number you might be a little more used to seeing. Now, this is the Waccamaw River at Conway Marina. So this is in Conway. this is what's happened. This was what we deem sunny day flooding actually occurring. So this is Hurricane Florence. This is 2018. It rains. Hurricane Florence drops all that rain in South Carolina and North Carolina. You see the first blip, that first little bump up, and then it goes down. That's the rain that fell in South Carolina in the Conway area. And it moves through the gauge and it blips and it starts to go down. And then the water from North Carolina starts to arrive along with the water upstream of Conway that fell in South Carolina. Those two, the South Carolina water enters first and you start seeing it rise again. And as part of that, then the water from North Carolina catches up and it rises even farther, setting a new record. Previous record was 17.9. It went to 21.2. Now, how do you have any idea what these numbers mean? Well, stage versus water surface elevation. So if the base flood elevation is 13.4 feet water surface elevation, that is equal to 19.5 feet in stage, which is what the gauge reads. The gauge reads stage. We're used to using, most people are used to hearing and understand the term of base flood elevation. So one thing to keep in mind, major flood stage is 14. So it's stage feet of 14, which is equal to 7.948 feet water surface elevation. So the record flood stage is 21.2, which equals 15.148 feet water surface elevation. So the base flood elevation is 13.4. We got only, now only being relative term, but we got almost 2 feet higher than base flood elevation. So major flood stage happens at 7, almost 8 feet of a water surface elevation. You've got to go to 13.4 before you reach the base flood elevation. You are pretty far into major flood stage, you know, before you're hitting that water surface elevation of 13.4, which equals the base flood elevation. And we went almost 2 feet higher than that in Florence. So it's important to be able to read these and understand what they mean. Major flood stage doesn't mean we've equaled or exceeded that 1% or 100-year or base flood elevation, that we've exceeded that. It just is a term that USGS uses and the National Weather Service uses about impacts that are happening on the ground. So how many structures, how many roads, what's being impacted. When it reaches major flood stage, they have a criteria that says, hey, we've impacted this amount of properties or roads or whatever they're using. And at that point, they say we've reached major flood stage. That doesn't mean it's reached, that the water levels actually reached that base flood elevation or reached that 1% event or exceeded it yet. It did exceed it in Florence in the Conway area by almost 2 feet. And in that area, with it being flat at the coast, so the low country, the PD, it's very flat, 2 feet spreads out pretty far. It's a pretty big impact. So with that, we have an initiative at SCDNR through the flood mitigation program. And this is a new website we just launched now. As I said before, we don't receive any state funding and we haven't for this. We've been doing this by grant. But what we built was we actually have a floodplain map viewer. So you can view a property and under that area, and you can view the floodplain layer for the state. So you can go in there and see that special flood hazard area and see what zone a piece of property would be in. So you can go in and you can search that. Also, on the other side, it says flood inundation and alerts viewer. This is where we are building a flood inundation and alert network. That has to do, the way this is built is it is built specifically to take, it has a prediction element and a current element to it. The prediction says up to 3 days out, it will provide a prediction of based on a storm coming ashore or something moving through the state and the National Weather Service is putting out a prediction for a certain level of rainfall. If that rainfall equates to a flood frequency event that's loaded into the system, it calculates what event that would be and then pulls a corresponding map and displays it on this website. It does it with a prediction, and then it updates based off of current information. Current being, okay, that event actually occurred, how much rain actually fell, and what are the conditions of the river at this time. And it can calculate and correlate, says, actually, we need to pull this map, this flood frequency. It's not a 25-year flood, it's a 50-year flood. It's not a 500-year flood, it's a 2,000-year flood. And it will pull that, and it will depict it on the map. We have this available in 3 Huck 8 watersheds, the Little PD, the Lumber, and the Black. We are currently have funding to complete the PD region of the state, and we are actively pursuing funding to complete this for the entire state. So it is open to the public. If you go to scfloodimpact.com, you can get in and you can see both sides. And right now, it rained today. It may fire on a prediction side. And current, it will fire at a 1% flood event. So, I mean, at a 1-year flood event. So don't be surprised if something shows up. It doesn't mean everything's getting inundated. It's just made to fire on smaller events so that we can track when it actually gets to the larger events. It's made to fire always. Even for smaller things, even when it doesn't come out of the stream channel, it's made to fire. Now, it is currently in areas that are quite swampy. So with that, it is important to keep that in mind. It'll have kind of water everywhere. It is done in a 2-dimensional model. Another thing to keep in mind, so with it being a 2-dimensional model, you might see where it looks like pockets of flooding. What it's doing is using the fancy terrain we have, and with that showing, it could only be a foot of water or less in there, or 18 inches, but it's going to show up because there's a dip in the terrain. It's basically showing puddles. It'll show puddles as well as the much more deep areas that are impacted that are closer to the rivers. I should also say, Charleston's coastline is done as well for our coastal, and it runs off of where that tidal influence is. So it always shows down there because there's always reporting a flood level down there, versus everywhere else, it's only going to depict if there's enough rainfall and enough water in the system to show a flood in a river situation. But at the coast, it's kind of always in some kind of condition where the gauges report, so you will see it all the time along the coast. We are looking for funding to expand that through all the coastal counties. And that's where, so if a storm were to be coming ashore, that would update for storm surge and things along those lines, like those true tidal influences down there. So that information is available as well. And with that, I am done, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Maria. That was very informative. I'm going to start a little out of order from when they've come in. There's a few mapping questions related to the site you just talked about. So can we see depth grids in the mapping site for each parcel in the county?
No, we are looking to add that in the future, but currently no. Not as far as the flood inundation and mapping for action site, the SC flood impact site, no. However, your local government will have it based on where we did updated information. So the local governments have it where we have converted something to a newer study. Wherever we've produced new information, it is available there at the local government level.
Okay, thank you. And just as a reminder to participants, please feel free to add some more questions into the Q&A. We do have time to get to all of them and some more, so please feel free to add some. I believe you already answered this one, but if you want to add any clarification, can the flood and inundation map system work for tidal events or just rainfall events?
Yeah, it does work for tidal, as I said, but like I said, I would, if we have time and there's interest, I can bring it up, but it's going to, like, when that forecast comes in with the from the National Weather Service saying there's a storm coming, it will predict that as well as go over to what's actually happening. It'll do the same thing. It's just in rivers, it's a little harder to shift back and forth. So we have to design that a little differently.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay. So this is a floodplain map update question for Horry County. There has been an increase in flood insurance premiums after recent storms, but they are unclear if there is a floodplain map change that went through. Has there been a recent change in these floodplains, specifically in unincorporated Myrtle Beach?
A map just went effective back in December of last year. So there was a map update that went effective. And I don't know specifically, there's two things going on with flood insurance. And the reason why I didn't have it in here is flood insurance can be kind of difficult right now because risk rating 2.0 has gone into effect. So as of April 1st of this year, everybody's being converted over to the risk rating 2.0 system. And that does indicate the way they're rating policies now is based specifically off of your proximity to a flooding source, your height above ground, some other factors. And they're doing that. So that could equate for why some of it may be showing up more than the storm. We don't update maps just because you have a flood event. We update based solely off of a statistical probability of that 1% occurring or not. Can flood events have an impact to that? Yes, but like I said, there's many factors, like I said in the presentation, but yes, there was an update, but also there is now a new way they're rating. I would highly encourage anybody that's seeing any rate increases to talk to your insurance agent. They can explain more. There's some proprietary information in there that they don't even share with us, but be able to maybe explain a little better how you're being rated and why you're rated the way you are. And then maybe your local floodplain, with that information, you could go to your local floodplain manager and they would be able to potentially help you know if getting an elevation certificate might help you, or doing some mitigation, some retrofitting to your home might assist in getting something, a little better rate for you.
Great, thank you. This is another CRS question. If an entire coastal area is included in the flood management program, does that give higher discounts for flood insurance rates under the CRS?
If they join CRS, you join the NFIP and then you can join CRS on top of that. And then that would give that participating community citizens a reduction based on how many, it's a point system, how many points they're able to accumulate. And for each class, as they call it, that they move down from 9, well, really from 10 down to 1, the more points you have, the lower the number gets, the higher the discount gets on your premium. So, and that's afforded to everybody under risk rating 2.0. Everybody in the community is going to be able to benefit from that. In the past, only if you were in the special flood hazard area did you benefit from that reduction in premium. Now, even people in an X zone will benefit.
Got it. Okay. So this one's switching gears a little bit. And I have to piece this one together because I had asked a clarification. So the degree in which soil saturation and evapotranspiration are important, and how do they affect the degree of flooding in South Carolina? Sorry, I had to,
okay.
I probably said that a little wrong, but did you get that?
I got it. Okay, the way it works is it has no impact when we have catastrophic flood events. Smaller flood events, yes. If we can, the more water that absorbs into the ground or evaporates into the air is going to cause less flooding. But when you have what we had in 2015, 2016, and 2018 specifically, when you have 300,000 cubic feet per second of water coming out of North Carolina into South Carolina, dropping 1,000 cubic feet per second off of that puts you at 299. It is not going to drop the water level, anything that you're going to be able to see. But in the smaller events, it does have some impact. But there's another factor in that. If we've been in drought conditions, true drought conditions, and we have a flood, the ground cannot absorb it fast enough. It's kind of like having concrete, being back to that impervious surface kind of stormwater issues where if you have impervious surface like concrete, like a parking lot, it's going to just run off. It's not going to absorb. It's going to do the same thing if we've been in a drought condition. It can't absorb it fast enough when it rains hard. So you can tend to have a flood event in those conditions as well. Same thing happens after a fire. It's almost like it encapsulates the soil. And that's why you see a lot of flooding after fires out west, or the Pinnacle Mountain fire here could have resulted in a catastrophic flood afterwards because the ground just is kind of shocked and can't absorb that water fast enough to help. But in normal, like, it's kind of, think of it this way. You take a sponge and the sponge is dry and you wet the sponge. A portion of the water runs off the sponge until the sponge catches up and can start absorbing. But then if the sponge is already completely saturated and you try to put more water into the sponge, it runs off as well. So that's kind of the best way to kind of describe how that soil moisture and evaporation. We pray for everything to evaporate that can possibly evaporate when we have a flood event, but it won't be enough in these catastrophic large-scale flood events. But the smaller ones, it can help us out quite a bit.
Great, thank you. And that was a great analogy.
I was trying to think, I was like, we used to explain that, it's like a sponge.
Okay, so I'm going to say what I think this one is saying and asking. I believe they're asking, why are they being allowed to, not what is the cause. So why are existing homes being flooded by neighbors being allowed to raise the lots in South Carolina? So I think the question is, why are those neighbors allowed to raise those lots that cause flooding?
Yes. In minimum NFIP, and this is one thing that is common, and we are the first to say that it gives a false sense of security too. You're allowed to fill in that fringe area. If you remember where I had the split up special flood hazard area, you can, in that outer section, that fringe, you can fill. And you can fill to at or above that base flood elevation. And that's legal, unless the community adopts a higher standard to prevent it. But they are exactly right that what can end up happening is you're filling one lot, and if you don't fill another lot, then what can happen is the other lot ends up being lower. This lot's been removed from the special flood hazard area. The lot next door or down the street or something along those lines may not be elevated by fill. So in that case, they're now lower and they're having to take all the water. So yes, it can happen. It's unfortunate, but it is not something most local governments choose to create a higher standard. We have some that do not allow fill in the special flood hazard area at all. Most do what's called compensatory storage if they do any higher standard, and that means for the amount of fill here, you got to take away an equal amount somewhere else, kind of balance it. But that's even it's not uniform across the state. So minimum NFIP does allow it. They're allowed to receive what's called a letter of map revision based on fill, thus removing them from the special flood hazard area, which also removes all the regulations to them and removes the mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. So hopefully that answered what they were looking for. So.
Thank you. Okay, so I have one more question left, unless someone wants to add some more, and that's totally fine. Please feel free to put more questions in Q&A. So after this one, I think we will have time for you to do that, the mapping aspect. Okay, so this question is in regards to flooding history or past events. So is there an agency that maintains records or is looking at the extent of locations that are having more regular flooding or more serious flooding? So a way to identify locations that fall into those categories.
I don't know that anybody specifically, I know USGS does. USGS is the official flood frequency determiner for a flood event. That's the best way to put it. They issue reports, and they are the official source for determining that. Some local governments track it. USGS also does high water marks. So I would say in the grand scheme, you would love for one to be tracking that specifically one area. I think what you're going to find is multiple agencies and multiple entities that are tracking, and it's your best resource is probably going to be to go to a local floodplain manager that can tap those resources and kind of tell you. One thing that is done as part of the NFIP, the one thing we do, and local governments are responsible for this, but we assist them, is after a flood event, they're required to go out and assess the structure for substantial damage, whether or not it was substantially damaged by NFIP standards or not, which is 50% of the market value or greater of the structure. And if it is substantially damaged, it's got to be brought into compliance with current code. So it might have to be elevated if it's below the current BFE, like a map change has occurred or something has happened, or an ordinance update that now has freeboards. It would have to be brought into compliance. But with that, not every flood event makes that occur. Now they might be doing damages, but that's why they know what's flooding. This is my point to this. They know what's flooding because they're supposed to be going and seeing what's flooding after every time the community floods. So they're your first resource. And then there might be some other resources that can assign, like what is that specific flood frequency? How many times is it flooding? There are some resources out there. And I think some people are trying to build like databases for that. We're not charged with that specifically, but we do have, like DNR has a hydrology department that might be able to provide some resources as well. So there's some stuff out there, but unfortunately, I'm not aware of anywhere tracking specifically everyone in certain areas.
Great, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. If you would like to walk through the mapping,
Sure.
like you were hoping to do.
Okay, I'm going to take us there. So, all right. So this is the website. I'm running it live. I'm an administrator, so I'm logged in, and you'll be able to see other things than what the general public might be able to see. So when you go on the floodplain viewer, the green block, the green outline counties are where we have preliminary information available, because you can move between preliminary and effective data. We're just going to zoom in because we're not looking in any particular area. This is effective. As you can see in the top left, it does tell you this is effective data. So this is currently what's effective. This is Sumter. Hold on, let me plug up my computer. Sorry, guys. Okay. If I click over and pull up preliminary, this is what is changing. It'll only show you the areas that are actually changing. You can change the transparency. It does allow you to do that for effective and preliminary. We also do map changes. So this is telling you what's increasing, decreasing, either special flood hazard area, did the floodway increase or decrease, whatever might be occurring. That is one, what we call flood risk product that we have available on the website for where we have effective and preliminary that is available. So that information, now if you were to click inside of here, let me go back to effective. So okay, if we were click inside of here, it will tell you what zone it is. It'll tell you the information. It'll give you some frequently asked questions about flood zones. It'll tell you if the zone is increased or decreased. This information, you have to be a local government to be able to see this. Like I said, I'm an administrator, so I see all kinds of stuff. But basically what this allows to happen is flood insurance study report, summary of map action, so what happens with letter map amendments, letter map revisions, and letter map revisions based on fill. And then these are the engineering models that DNR has created through the map updating process. So the 2016 flood insurance study update and the 2018 in Sumter, those are in there as well. They are currently under the Black River watershed getting ready to get another update. So there will be more loaded to this soon. But you can move around and see the effective layer. It is a seamless layer for the entire state. you can identify certain information. You can actually print this. There is the ability to change, if you wanted to change the base map, you can do that. That is available. And then for the inundation side, it may, like I said, I don't know if it's firing or not. This is what the coast looks like. Okay. Currently, so when you go in at the coast, as you can see, the reason why it's doing this is because there's always something reporting that there is stuff occurring down there as far as there is water in places, but and it'll change based off of the tide because these are running off the gauges. The way this works is currently we're not showing anything. Let's see if there's anything popping up. Nothing's popping up under a forecast in our designated areas. So nothing's showing, so sorry guys, can't show you what it looks like, but it basically looks the same as what the coast looks like. It'll look the same as far as it'll be a depiction of an extent. Something that's important is you can put the radar on. Might get it to fire later today. Up in this area is where we have mapping occurring, where we have it loaded to the website, where we've received funding. This down here, where it's raining in the other areas, we unfortunately have not have been able to load because we just received funding or haven't received funding yet to produce. But you can turn the radar on. You can also turn that back off if that's distracting. You can also see the little triangles pop up, and first, if you click on them. So I clicked on an area, it gives you a forecast. You can also set an alert. If you click set location alert, if that's where you live, you can set an alert and it'll alert you if there's a flood. For the areas that we have information running as far as in the lumber watershed, the little PD, and the black. So in the black, it would be, if we clicked somewhere over here, you'd be able to get one. But you notice it's giving, this is what the stream gauge, that is a forecast stream gauge. It's Kingstree. So it's saying right now it's consistent with no flooding, but it'll tell you what that minor, moderate, and major flood stages are. We are working with a future update to put that base flood elevation in there so people will know where that is, like I talked about in the presentation. And so doesn't look real impressive right now. I'll be the first to tell you because it's not firing, but it will fire. It may fire later today with the rain moving through if they get enough rain in this area, but it looks very similar to what the coast looks like. And Maria, it will tell you, yes.
We got a question real quick on the alert. Sure. Does the app that you have alert users when tidal flooding might impact them?
Yes, if you were to click down in one of these areas and you can set an alert location, it just asks for your email address and it'll alert. Now, we will not spam you. I don't want to be spammed either because every time one goes out, every time it fires, it sends me an email. So I treat you, we're treating everybody the way we want to be treated. It's going to alert you when the first impact of something is going to occur and then as something changes. So it's not going to alert you every time the system is checking the gauges. It won't do that. So it's not going to alert you every 15 minutes. It's not going to alert you every 3 hours or anything along those lines. It's going to alert based off of, you're going to get your first alert, and then if something changes, it will alert then. Hopefully that helps as well. I know that was personal, but.
And then another question, which maybe this is something that needs to be clicked or something. How did you get the storm icon? This person is doing it along with you and theirs is not showing up.
Oh, it may be because I'm an administrator.
So that may not be an option for non-administrators.
Oh, this one right here, is it the toggle?
I'm assuming so. If that is incorrect, please.
It should show up. I can check. We'll check that. Thank you for letting us know. We'll check that and make sure it's showing up on the, if you're not, it should show up. But if it's, we'll double check it. Thank you for letting us know because that might be
the one they're talking about.
Okay, good. Then we'll check it because it should be showing up where you can toggle on the radar for the day.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Maria. We really appreciate you.
Just so everybody knows, we haven't been hiding it. It's brand new. It just launched the beginning of April. So it's pretty new. I threw it in real quick because I did not have it in the presentation. So thank y'all for allowing me to do that.
Of course. If you want to, so there you go. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick and share. There we go. Can you see my presentation?
Yes,
okay.
I can.
Great. So I want to thank Ellen and Maria very much for coming today and speaking with us and for our Flooding 411 webinar. And we will be following up with an email that will have links and information that you saw today. And then we will be posting a recording on our YouTube channel for Flooding 411. So you will have a chance to see it again if you want to, or tell your friends. And so if you have any questions, you can always contact our team at our Gmail address, which you'll see at the bottom here. And please remember that we have 2 more Flooding 411 sessions on June 22nd, which is reducing flood impacts to your property and community. And then on June 29th, for our final session of the summer series, will be successful community flood management. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us and let us know. And we appreciate your attendance. And thank you so much, Maria and Ellen. We really appreciate all of your information and all of your insight. So with that, I thank everyone and please have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And for those of you still on, please fill out our evaluation. I put it in the chat, but I'll also send it through the follow-up email.